God sees where I am. He sees me, but he also sees what could be. He sees the things that he could use me for. He sees the things that I can accomplish with his power and his strength. But what I want us to have a sense of, and maybe a greater sense of over the next few weeks, is that God has a calling for each of us. That each of us who have given our lives to God, that God invites us. God summons us to make certain decisions, to be around certain people, to do certain things. And he's always done that. Again, if you look through Scripture, I can give you multiple examples. But think about Moses. If you know anything about Moses, Moses was called by God specifically to lead God's people out of slavery in Egypt, to lead them across a wilderness, to lead them into the land that God had prepared to give them. You look at David. David was called by God to be a great warrior, to be a great leader in the army of Israel, to fight against God's enemies, to be a great king over God's people. Jeremiah was called by God to give really challenging messages to God's people, things that they needed to hear but maybe didn't want to hear. And God called Jeremiah to fill that role. God called Nehemiah to leave where God's people were in captivity and to go hundreds of miles back to the homeland of the Israelite people and to rebuild the walls of the city of Jerusalem. That was a calling that God gave Nehemiah. You move into the New Testament. I mean, Jesus literally called his apostles, his disciples, right? You see him walking into different places and going and looking at somebody and going, "Come, follow me." That's a calling. That's an invitation. But God even called, Joseph and Mary to be the parents of Jesus in the first place. That was a calling. When God shows up, when the angel shows up with Mary and says, "You're going to be pregnant, you're going to give birth to the Son of God," and she just responds, "Okay." That he called her to that role. Joseph was getting ready to get out of this relationship altogether, and God called him to stay there and to be the father of Jesus on this earth. I mean, the list could go on and on of all sorts of different Bible characters that received a calling, that received an invitation from God, a summoning from him. Here's something that I am choosing for you to do and choosing for you to be a part of. And I believe that God still does that today. I really do. I think that God still puts things on our hearts, that God still moves us to certain actions, that God still invites us to join him in a certain direction that he's going, a certain purpose that he wants us to accomplish. And I also believe that as God does that often God sees something in us that we don't necessarily see in ourselves. That the reason God calls us is for his purpose and to use us to bless somebody else in some way, but oftentimes it is something completely surprising to us. We wouldn't have even thought to go that direction, to do that particular thing. And yet God sees that potential in us and calls us to speak to somebody that we wouldn't have thought to speak to. God calls us to share our story with somebody that needs to hear it. God calls us to invite someone else to come to church, to come to Connection Group, or just to come get coffee with us so that we can speak some truth and some love into their lives. God calls us to volunteer. God calls us to volunteer in our communities. God calls us to volunteer here in this church. God calls us to pray for people, to pray about certain things. I think God calls us on a regular basis for specific purposes, to go specific directions, to do specific things. But when we experience a calling from God, I think there's three vital elements of that calling that I want us to see this morning. And you can see it on the front of your bulletins. You can see it up on the screen. These three things that God calls us to, that we experience because of that calling. That any person who is called by God is seen, is selected, and is sent. Seen, selected, and sent. Say it with me. Seen, selected, sent. One more time. Seen, selected, sent. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean? What does it mean to be seen by God when he calls us? In each example that I just gave you of different people in Scripture that were called by God for a specific action or for a specific purpose, God saw that person where they were. Whatever situation they were in, whatever they were doing in life at that moment, God saw them. God focused on them. He saw them. But he also saw the potential. He saw who they could be. He saw what they could do. God saw Moses out in the wilderness watching a bunch of sheep. God saw that Moses was hiding from his past because he had once been a prince of Egypt, but he had also been a murderer. And he's out in the wilderness trying to hide from his past. God saw him there. But God also saw the leader that Moses could be when he called him. He saw his potential. God saw David as this young kid out also watching a bunch of sheep. God saw him as the youngest brother. He was the littlest one. He probably got picked on by his older brothers. He was insignificant. He was just some random kid out in the mountains taking care of sheep. But God also saw the warrior that he could be, the leader that he could be, the man of God that he could be. God saw Jeremiah, and Jeremiah was a priest. Jeremiah was going to be a priest like his ancestors before him. He had a plan. He had a vision of what his life was going to be like. And God saw him there in that role. But God also saw the potential in Jeremiah to share really challenging, really difficult messages with people that probably didn't want to hear them. God saw Nehemiah hundreds of miles from home. God saw him being a cupbearer, a wine taster for a foreign king who had no training in wall building, who was not an engineer or an architect. And God saw all the potential in Nehemiah and all that he could accomplish. You see what I'm saying? When God is ready to call us, God sees us. God sees where I am. And in that moment when he focuses on me, when he sees me, he doesn't just see the good stuff. He sees my flaws, and he sees my fears, and he sees all the things that I have no confidence in myself about. He sees all the skills that I don't have, and all the mistakes that I've made, and all the times that I've failed. He sees me, but he also sees what could be. He sees the things that he could use me for. He sees the things that I can accomplish with his power and his strength.